Gracias por volver a esta sesión de la tarde, el tercer foro de la cultura. Mi nombre es José Luis de Vicente, soy especialista en cultura y tecnología, soy comisario del Festival Sonar en Barcelona y tengo el enorme placer de conducir esta sesión con dos invitados excepcionales sobre el que es, sin ninguna duda, uno de los temas que en este momento pesan sobre el cruce entre tecnología y transformaciones culturales, políticas y económicas de profundo orden. Hablar de inteligencia artificial, hablar de machine learning, hoy en día es enfrentarse, por un lado, a una tecnología que está cambiando muy rápidamente, pero también a un conjunto de relatos, algunos de ellos que tienen que ver con nuestras percepciones más primeras de la tecnología, muy antiguos y que nos sitúan en un escenario siempre de incertidumbre, de temor, de una cierta distancia. No sé hasta qué punto el público es consciente, y quizás quería dedicarle un segundito a esto, del estado de la cuestión en un ámbito como el machine learning o el deep learning, sobre todo de los avances que se han producido en los últimos 5 o 6 años. Una buena manera de entender dónde estamos o el grado de las transformaciones que se están produciendo es pensar que el año pasado fue el 20 aniversario de cruzar un hito histórico en la relación entre habilidades que considerábamos humanas y habilidades que estaban siendo por primera vez adoptadas también por sistemas artificiales. Estoy hablando de la famosa victoria del ordenador Deep Blue sobre Garry Kasparov, el mejor jugador de ajedrez en aquel momento, en un enfrentamiento entre hombre y máquina que se consideró histórico. Por supuesto, era la primera vez que el mejor jugador de ajedrez del mundo no podía ganar al mejor ordenador del mundo. La historia, y es conocida, es que en cualquier caso Deep Blue no era un jugador que jugara él solo. Deep Blue era una especie de jugador rodeado por un gran equipo de entrenadores y que esos entrenadores eran humanos que le enseñaron toda la historia del ajedrez, que le dotaron de una increíble memoria en la que poder entender la historia de la disciplina y le dieron unas posibilidades enormes para entender cómo se jugaba el ajedrez a partir de este equipo de entrenadores humanos hasta cierto punto. Kasparov, de hecho, nunca estuvo convencido que aquella victoria fuera completamente limpia e incluso le pidió a IBM repeticiones de aquellas partidas que nunca se celebraron. Durante 20 años hubo otro juego más complejo aún que el ajedrez, en el que el hombre siguió siendo netamente superior al ordenador. Es el juego japonés del Go, un juego muy antiguo en el que, para entenderlo, el mejor ordenador del mundo era un jugador mediocre que ni siquiera podía competir con jugadores no de élite, sino medianos al juego del Go. Y en octubre del 2015, hace poco más de 3 años, AlphaGo, un programa generado por la compañía con sede en Reino Unido, DeepMind, se convirtió en el primer jugador de Go en ganar el primer programa informático en ganar a un jugador de Go. Pero eso no fue lo más interesante. Lo más interesante fue que a partir de esta victoria y de este programa AlphaGo surgió un programa posterior, AlphaGo Zero, que podía aplicarse a otros juegos y podían tener la capacidad de jugar también y de ganar a jugadores humanos en otros juegos. En diciembre de 2017, dentro de poco hará un año, AlphaGo Zero se convirtió en el mejor programa informático de ajedrez. Fue capaz de ganar al mejor programa de ajedrez en ese momento, pero con una gran diferencia, con una transición que marcaba determinadamente y que explica muy bien el punto en el que estamos ahora. AlphaGo Zero no se convirtió en el mejor jugador de ajedrez del mundo después de meses de trabajo con equipos humanos asistiendo a su funcionamiento, después de obtener el catálogo enorme de grandes jugadas de la historia en el ajedrez. A AlphaGo Zero sencillamente se le entregaron las reglas del ajedrez, se le dijeron, estas son las reglas del ajedrez, compite contra ti mismo. Y AlphaGo Zero fue capaz de convertirse en el mejor jugador de ajedrez del mundo solo 4 horas más tarde. La distancia que hay entre AlphaGo Zero y Deep Blue de alguna manera muestra en nuestra imaginación cómo la inteligencia artificial se ha convertido en una nueva enorme promesa y por tanto también, siempre que hay una gran promesa tecnológica, en una gran amenaza. Probablemente es más útil no hablar de inteligencia, es algo de lo que hablaremos hoy, es hablar de técnicas de deep learning, técnicas de machine learning, que se están aplicando en una cantidad de aplicaciones posibles en ámbitos que van desde la salud, la seguridad, la economía, por supuesto la automatización de muchísimos procesos y decisiones. Y estamos en un momento de grandes preguntas y de grandes dudas acerca de hacia dónde nos lleva y en qué posición nos acercamos, no con miedo, no con temor, pero sí con conciencia y con capacidad de conciencia crítica a los cambios que hoy estamos viviendo. Para hablar de todo esto tengo a mi lado a dos excepcionales personalidades que han desarrollado una carrera muy importante en este ámbito. Tengo a mi derecha a Eleanor Saita, que es para mí una de las mentes que es capaz, desde su actividad profesional, pero también desde su actividad intelectual, explicar mejor los entrecruces de sistemas tecnológicos, políticos y estratégicos que nos envuelven hoy en día. Y vamos a empezar dándole la palabra con alguien que es un histórico. Realmente es una de las voces que ha construido a lo largo de los últimos 20 años un discurso crítico alrededor de qué era esta cosa llamada Internet, qué posibilidades ofrecía desde los órdenes culturales, económicos y políticos. Estoy hablando de Dave Weinberger. Dave Weinberger, a los que recordamos, aquellos que allá a finales de los 90 empezamos a acercarnos a ese gran nuevo espacio utópico que era Internet como el formulador de quizás la primera teoría organizada de las posibilidades de Internet frente a otros medios de comunicación anteriores. En un texto, en un libro que se llama Small Pieces Loosely Joined, es también el autor de un texto anterior muy importante, el Clue Train Manifesto, uno de los primeros documentos sobre cómo habría una nueva economía que tenía impacto sobre el comercio, sobre el marketing que surgía en el ámbito de Internet. Dave es, desde hace muchos años, escritor, escribe sobre tecnología, su formación es filosófica, es investigador en el Berman Center de la Universidad de Harvard desde hace mucho tiempo. Ha sido codirector del Innovation Lab de la Biblioteca de Harvard, que es algo de lo que creo que habrá a hablar mañana, de hecho, en otra presentación. Y, como decía antes, sus libros son una manera de entender la historia intelectual de Internet como medio a lo largo de los últimos 20 años y os recomiendo encarecidamente que os acerquéis a ellos. Hemos estado hablando un rato antes de entrar, actualmente está haciendo una residencia en Google como escritor en residencia, pero me ha pedido que deje claro que no representa los puntos de vista o la posición de Google y no habla por su boca, pero es para nosotros interesante porque creo que también es un testimonio de su evolución y es un gran placer y un lujo tenerlo aquí hoy con nosotros. Thanks so much, Dave.
Thank you. I'm speaking English. Just to be clear, my earpiece fell out. For the past 5 months, I've been a writer in residence at Google, and I'm there as an outsider. So, yeah, I do not speak for Google. So the topic is AI, artificial intelligence, and control. And as Jose indicated, we're not going to be talking about intelligence. One of the reasons why people fear AI, I think, is frequently comes up. It's the rise of the robot. The robot army is going to gain consciousness and take over. And, okay, but we're not going to talk about that unless you want to, in which case we will. For me, at least in my circle and wanderings, the next big reason why people seem to be afraid of AI is because of its inexplicability. That is, it can be beyond human understanding. How it comes up with its decisions, I want to put that in quotes because AI doesn't come up with decisions or do anything mental at all, but it comes up with in some cases it comes up with its decisions in ways that humans simply cannot understand no matter how hard we look. There's controversy among computer scientists, of which I am not, I'm just a writer, about whether that's inevitable. It may be that we can use some technological advances in order to make all AI understandable by humans, but we are not there yet, and I think there are reasons to think that maybe we won't be. So I want to talk about two reasons I think maybe we fear AI in that regard, its inexplicability. And the first has to do with fairness, and the second has to do with something a little more metaphysical or something. So the question of fairness and AI is very, very real, and it's very, very important. It comes about because the way that machine learning, which is the type of AI that we are going to be talking about primarily and that you've referred to, machine learning works really differently than traditional computers do. With a traditional computer, and excuse me if you all know this, but traditional computer, a programmer models some domain the way that you would if you were setting up a spreadsheet to represent your household finances or your business. You decide what the factors are that count and how they're related, how expenses relate to taxes and relate to revenues and all the rest of it. Like a spreadsheet. You program that into the computer, you enter some data, and you get an output according to that model of your business. That's not how machine learning works. Machine learning, especially the form known as deep learning, but basically all machine learning takes in vast amounts of data, which are just numbers. To the computer, it's just numbers. And without telling the computer ahead of time what the model is, what are the factors that affect this or that. Instead, you just give it the data, and the machine figures out the correlations among all of these vast variables. There can be tens of thousands of factors or variables that get related to each other in probabilistic ways, in giant, delicate networks of relationships where, in some cases, a small change in a small variable can cause a cascade of events that changes, that flips the outcome of the computer. And in some cases, humans looking at these simply cannot follow the vast number of variables in their vast number of connections. Just can't. The results can be very important. Now, the reason fairness comes up right away, well, the main reason is that these networks, these models that the computers are building for themselves are based upon data that necessarily reflects human biases. It's data about our present and our history, our immediate past, and that we live in biased societies in lots of different ways, many of them pernicious. So, for example, if you are interested in creating a machine learning system that will look through job applications to make recommendations about who should get a personal interview, an in-person interview. And it's for a senior management position. And you feed in data about the current workforce, that data will have, women are underrepresented in senior management positions. That's in the data, because that's in our life, unfortunately. And so the machine learning system would be perfectly capable of looking at that data, analyzing it, and saying, there's a negative or poor correlation between being a woman and being a qualified senior manager. And that might get reflected in the output. That's obviously unfair. And it will come about, it can easily come about if we are not thoughtful about the data that we're bringing in and the algorithms that we use to process it. Machine learning, in the first instance, can be unfair. It can repeat the unfairness in our culture, and it can amplify it. That is a very real danger. It happens. We know it happens. It needs to be guarded against, and it's something to fear. It's a legitimate fear without a doubt. And so our response often has been that we should therefore be able to inspect the algorithms to see if it's being unfair. And there's certainly, when that can be done, that makes, of course. And there are more and more tools being created to allow computer scientists to analyze. But we can't always, at least not yet. One alternative is to insist that these algorithms, these systems be transparent so we can understand them, but there is a price to that. There can be a price to that. Sometimes there isn't, sometimes there can be. And it's, from my point of view, it's not the only way to guard against unfairness and other bad outcomes. This sort of unfairness is just the clearest example. So sometimes, yes, we will want to limit the complexity of the model that the machine learning system creates for itself. Because we want, for example, in the judicial system, if we're going to use machine learning, as we do in the United States, in many ways quite unfortunately, at this point anyway, it may be important to the system, may be important to the society that we trust in the processes by which the decisions were reached. And that's generally the case in the judicial system. We want to know that the process was fair. And perfectly reasonable, I think, is to insist on that for any AI systems that we use. But there are other instances where there are other trade-offs. And transparency is not the only way to control AI. I'll give you a quick example, then I'll move to the second point. So driverless cars are already here, not en masse, but they're here, and they are guided by AI. Eventually, I think, It's entirely plausible that these systems will be guided by AI that is not understandable by humans, because they're dealing with the interaction of not only thousands of cars on the road at one time, which are very likely going to be communicating with each other over a network, but they will also be taking in data from other systems, like weather systems, AI predicting weather, and the flow of pedestrians after some big sporting event, and the rest of it. And each of these systems may be wildly complex, and you combine them into one in a car that's trying to make a decision. Should it go left or go right or swerve or stop? And it may well be practically impossible to figure out what how the car came to that decision. But there can be enormous benefits to systems of driverless cars. Enormous problems, but also fatality rates can drop. The effect on the environment can significantly drop as well. So there are other ways of trying to control systems of autonomous cars, other than driverless vehicles, other than by insisting that their AI be transparent and understandable to us. For example, we can, as a society, say, look, what we want from these systems, first of all, we want fewer traffic fatalities. That one's pretty easy. But second of all, we are willing to make some of the drives longer if it will result in a lower, it's a bad example, lower carbon impact. We may decide that the comfort of people in cars is more or less important than whatever. There's a series of things that these cars will have to be optimized for, goals that we set for them. It's, I think, vitally important that we as a society do it, not leave it to the car manufacturers. But making those decisions is going to be fearsomely difficult and will involve all of the judicial and political and social and moral and systems that we have at play in our societies. But that's where the decisions ought to be made. They're not going to be simple, they're going to be complex. Having made those decisions about what we want from the system of AVs, we can then monitor them. We can insist that those decisions, those goals be transparent, and we can insist that the metrics and measurements also be made transparent. So if some manufacturers' cars are failing to meet those goals, we can require them through regulation to fix their cars. Just as now, if they're not meeting emissions controls for pollution control, we can tell the manufacturer, fix it. We don't tell them how to fix it. We don't say, we need to know exactly how your system, why it's failing. We can tell them, just get it to work. And we can do the same sort of thing possibly for autonomous vehicles as well. So this is a way of controlling an AI system that is going to be quite important to all of us without insisting on transparency of how it works. We can insist on transparency of goals and transparency of metrics. And it will be different in different systems. So, okay, here's my second point. So the first is that, just to be clear, that one of the reasons we fear AI is that it is inexplicable to us and in some instances may remain inexplicable, but the solution to this fear is not necessarily making all systems simple enough that we can understand them. Second point, briefer, is that, for thousands of years in the West, humans have assumed overall, generalizing, but that we are a special species. We're special. We're the top of the heap, and primarily because, depending on what era you look at, we are the special creatures who are able to understand our world. We can understand the universe. It's pretty awesome. This was because God made us in His image, not physically, of course, but by giving us a mind that is capable of understanding some of the glory and beauty of the universe He made for us and how it works. In later ages, not just that, but also that the world happens, as with Newton, that the world happens to operate according to a relative handful of relatively simple rules that are amazingly, by coincidence or by the hand of God, simple enough for humans to understand them. Our brain happens to be able to, and of all the creatures in the universe, we are the special ones. Now along comes a technology that we feed data into and it comes up with a different model, one that does not have to reduce its understanding to a set of simple rules. And no simple rules may come out of it. Now in the Go case, in AlphaGo, in fact, there was a new tactic that emerged that human players looked at it and said something like, tends to play aggressively until the end, or I forget what it was actually, I don't play Go, but it's building up on the side and that seems sort of weird, but it sort of works. So occasionally you get a simple rule out of it, but generally you don't. And especially when it's inexplicable, it's just all of these bits, all of these data points connected to all of the others. These systems don't work by simplifying the world. They work by making it more complicated than we can follow. And what's worse for our pride and our understanding of our place in the world is that these systems work better than we do. That's why we use them. If they didn't, it would be uninteresting tech, but these systems are doing things better than we can and some things we simply cannot do, and doing it in a very different sort of way. This means that, well, maybe what we have prided ourselves on, our place in the universe, isn't as special as we thought, and maybe isn't special at all. In fact, maybe the universe isn't ours to understand. Maybe our understanding, maybe it's not simply that we are not as well constructed to understand the universe as we thought. It may be that maybe our way of understanding isn't even all that much at home in the universe. That is a distressing thought that I think is causing there's plenty of reasonable fear and anxiety to have about AI, and we'll be talking about it. But I think maybe that thought is so disquieting to us that it's giving us an unreasonable anxiety in addition.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Dave, for this first introduction. Dave Weinberger ha explicado básicamente, o ha querido exponer las dos ideas que le parecen más importantes para entrar en este tema, la cuestión de qué manera desplaza la inteligencia artificial a la humana o cómo de alguna forma la obliga a ser reevaluada y perder su lugar preferencial como único centro emisor de conocimiento en el mundo, y por otro lado la cuestión de cómo nos aseguramos que las decisiones, que sistemas que no acabamos de entender son justas y son equilibradas, nos impactan de manera adecuada. Eleanor Saita es, como he dicho antes, que una de las personas a las que resulta más útil seguir, y os animo a que la sigáis en medios como Twitter, para entender de qué manera el despliegue de tecnologías tienen implicaciones que afectan todos los órdenes de nuestra sociedad, desde lo geoestratégico, desde de qué manera controlamos las fuentes de recursos y que establecen las tensiones entre poderes en el mundo, de qué manera determinan nuestras libertades, nuestras capacidades de acción en el mundo. Eleanor es una diseñadora, artista, escritora y hacker, trabaja desde hace muchos años en el ámbito de los sistemas de seguridad y seguridad informática, y yo diría que su aportación más interesante es crear de alguna manera un vocabulario reflexivo sobre la crítica de sistemas y cómo estos sistemas impactan en nuestra vida desde múltiples maneras. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Eleanor.
So I want to start out by disagreeing with the entire proposition of this panel.
Okay. We expected less.
Yeah. Specifically, I think that the frame of artificial intelligence is a dangerous phrase. And not a dangerous phrase because it's going to, a dangerous phrase because it leads us astray, right? It leads us to think about science fiction robots. How many people here have seen Westworld? A few, okay. Yeah. You get these sentient AIs and these computers that are coming out to take over the world. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is statistical automation, right? Data-driven statistical automation. It's basically the same thing that bureaucrats have been doing for, I don't think we can actually say thousands, but we can definitely say hundreds of years. We're just doing it faster, and we're doing it on many more data points. And that distinction is really useful and really important because it gets us away from some of this kind of magical thinking. And I think that if you think of a set of bureaucrats who are implementing bureaucratic rules to control a society, you expect them to understand the consequences of their decisions, right? And I recognize that this is not necessarily borne out in many modern political institutions. But in theory, when you have a law passed, it is passed with, some amount of due process and some amount of consideration of what the outcomes will be. And then those outcomes are studied over time. And if that law does not result in the outcome that we thought it was going to have, then we repeal the law and we try something else. What you really wouldn't expect bureaucrats to do is to say, okay, so we're going to write a law, but we're not really going to write a law. We're going to do a bunch of micro experiments that we don't really understand even the questions that we're asking, and then we're just going to implement a thing and then ship it and see what happens. And that's basically what we do with AI. And that structure of talking about bureaucrats, I think is really useful. This is why I talk about it as social automation, right? Because it is actually about tools of social control and tools of structural control over populations, over processes, over machines, but it's about control structures. Now, one of the things that David said, which I'm also going to take issue with, is you talked about these AI systems being better than us. I don't think they're better than us. I think the only thing they are is radically cheaper than us. There are very, very few cases where a statistical automation system, there are cases where statistical automation systems are faster than us. There are very few cases where that matters, right? If you are writing a braking algorithm for a car, then yes, you care that it is faster than us. However, we don't have any instances of automated vehicles coming within, 4 orders of magnitude of the safety of a trained human driver on real-world conditions that are not Menlo Park or Cupertino, where there's nothing in the road and a very legible environment. If you want to drive a car through, kind of the old city here, where you've got people coming from all sorts of places, I live in Finland. You want to drive a driverless car in snow? Forget it. They often just fail completely. They do not understand these systems because they need to have a very small, predictable world. And so in many cases, they are either, sometimes they're faster, mostly just that they're cheaper, right? And the reason why cost matters is because the thing that we're trying to do when we look at large-scale statistical automation is we're trying to control, instead of populations, we're trying to control individuals. We're trying to reduce the scale and the granularity of control, because this has been the dream of autocrats forever, right? Instead of saying that, oh, I will shape the population in these broad strokes, no, I want to get inside everyone's head individually, right? This is the cop in the head. And the dream of AI is the very cheap cop in everyone's head. And often these are for good things, right? This can be one of the things that the Government Digital Services Bureau in the UK did when they got stood up. They started looking at different government processes and the outcomes of those government processes. And they had this group that they called the Nudge Unit that looked at shaping decision-making processes. So for instance, if you have a place where you're asking people whether or not they want to become organ donors, and instead of, they realized that, well, we can, instead of saying, hey, check this box if you want to become an organ donor, we can actually just flip it around and say, check this box if you don't want to become an organ donor. And that had a massive impact on organ donation rates. Great, everyone benefits, like this is a very desirable social good. It's broadly agreed upon. But it's that kind of large-scale manipulation that these tools are done for, even if they're done for good outcomes. So I think it's much more useful when you start looking at tools of control, and this is why I'm questioning the frame. It's not really whether AI will control us. AI is the wrong words because it leads us down the wrong path. But moreover, it is the wrong concept because it's not AI that's controlling us. Statistics as a field do not have agency in the world. A Bayesian estimation algorithm never killed anyone. A government with a Bayesian estimation algorithm has killed lots of people. And I think that understanding where the control is coming from and where the intent is coming from is very important in this kind of discussion. There are, at a large scale, there are 3 challenges. We have states, we have companies, and we have empathy. These are the 3 control structures that we're dealing with right now. Empathy is a little bit out of bounds for this topic, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's important for our current moment. And both states and companies are using tools of statistical automation to shape human behavior at scale. With states, we see, for instance, on the kind of more on the less exotic side, we things like public health campaigns and that kind of thing. These very practical things that mostly have good ends. But we also see predictive policing, it's called. For instance, I'm going to model where all of the crimes occur in a city, and then to ensure the best use of police resources, I'm going to send more cops to where those crimes happen. Now, it turns out that crimes happen where you look, right? That if you send a bunch of cops to a place, the job of the police is to find crimes there, so they will find crimes there. And given that your starting data is all biased along socioeconomic lines, if you have a poor neighborhood, a working class neighborhood, an immigrant neighborhood that has a lot of crime, and you recognize that from your model, and then you send more cops there, you find more crime there, right? This has nothing to do with what's actually going on with the population. And so there are a lot of these places where states are using these kind of statistical automation tools. Sentencing in courts is another great example where you get a lot of these biases built in, that kind of thing. But we see this in other places like predictive intelligence work done around trying to model activist networks. The state police forces in a lot of European countries are very active, frankly, in most cases, at suppressing left activism. There is a lot of bias, and we see large-scale tracking of activist networks, then often bleeding over into state suppression of activist groups in other contexts. And increasingly, a lot of that work is bound up around these same kind of statistical modeling and statistical prediction tools. If we look at, if we look at China, for instance, we see much more overt intentional statistical control of populations. If you are friends with people who express certain political opinions, you're not going to get travel permits. You're going to have a harder time getting credit for small business loans or personal credit. You're not going to be allowed to go on vacations. There's a lot of this kind of really overt stuff that's happening. We also see foreign manipulation, like the current charismatic megafauna there is Russia, with a bunch of interference in elections around the world as part of kind of a new phase of Russian empire building. The U.S. does this too, but we see these kinds of state control. We also see company control, right? Facebook does a lot of work to make you buy things that you don't want, or to simply keep using Facebook. A lot of the effort that Facebook spends on designing the communication tools that you use every day is driven to make them less efficient. Because if you have a very efficient communication tool, then you get off Facebook and you go do other things and you go live your life. And we can trace this back through the kind of through the structure of economic incentives that a lot of these companies are driven for. When we look at the way most of our current social infrastructure, which is to say tech companies and communication companies and that kind of thing, are funded, they're funded through VC companies. Most VC companies have a model of a 20x return on investment. They want 20 times what they put in 3 to 5 years, and they will accept a 95% failure rate. The venture capital industry as a whole breaks even. A few VC companies make a lot of money, a lot of them lose a lot of money. This has two effects. One, it means that we are building social infrastructure on platforms that are designed to fail in the short term, which creates a huge amount of social churn. But more relevant to our subject, it means that these companies are driven towards models that allow this kind of geometric scalability. And those end up being models of large-scale manipulation, right? One of the models that's used a lot is this idea of engagement. It turns out that a really engaging thing is a flame war. If you have a bunch of people in your town who are, calling each other fascists and communists and whatever, and causing this kind of massive social strife and social polarization, they're super engaged with the platform that they're doing this on. And that platform is actively manipulating them to stay engaged. Right? These tools of social control are being used to shape population response because Facebook doesn't pay the bill when Myanmar has a genocide. The Myanmar genocide that happened recently was significantly driven by Facebook in the same way that access to radio had a significant impact in the Rwandan genocide. Facebook didn't even have anyone who spoke the language. They were warned that this was going to happen. They just ignored it because, you know what? Human lives are an externality to these companies. So it's not AI that's controlling us. It's companies that are controlling us. It's states that are controlling us. And I think that focusing on the technology is absolutely critical because it talks to us about the valence of control, the structures of control, the places where we can push back, these kinds of things. But it can also become missing the forest for the trees. And I think that it's very important to see both of these hats together. I want to talk about a couple of other things. One of the things that we are also having a problem with is empathy. We have had an untold number of people move online very quickly, right? It took us 140, 150 years to get half the population to live in cities. And for a big chunk of that time, you walk into a cafe, you're fresh off the farm, you hear the guy next to you at the table talking about, oh, somebody's sleeping with somebody. You've never heard a conversation like that wasn't directly relevant to your life, and you don't know how to not listen, right? Civic inattention was not a thing that came naturally to us. We had to learn how to do this over really a large period of time. We moved 20 million people into 2 billion people into one global city in 20 years. We are currently at the place where we are just walking out into the street and getting pasted by trams. We didn't realize that there were trams in our city, but now we all live in this one global city, and we don't understand how to live here. We don't have civic inattention for the network. And this means that you have this constant stream of all of the tragedies of the world coming by this little piece of glass that you spend all of your time with every day. And you feel all of those tragedies as though they were happening to people you know, and it's killing us. It's causing this the number of people I know. I have a friend who had a heart attack, a couple of friends who've had heart attacks from political PTSD, just because they couldn't disengage with these structures. And these are the things that both the states and the companies are hooking into. They're hooking into these structures where we have no defense mechanisms because we don't know how to live as a networked species yet. So let's go from there.
Okay, so many things on the table. And I think that we are all in agreement that this conversation was not about killing robots or the awakening of a new species that will replace us as humans, but about actually this whole can of worms that we're sitting on and the new ones that we are opening all the time, So I think that there's enough disagreements on the table, so you can start whenever you want to. But I wanted to throw something here, which is about this tension between transparency and trust. If it's important that we build systems that we understand and we get to be able somehow to get to the position where we can know how they're working, or if it's actually trust the problem that we need to solve. Because you could say that we are sitting in crisis of transparency and crisis of trust anyway. We are using systems that we don't trust. Many of the reasons have been defined by Eleanor recently, but also we are using systems that we cannot inspect, that we cannot really get to access. So how do we solve our crisis of trust, our transparency, and why do you think that maybe we don't need to solve both at the same time, or that actually the whole thing doesn't need to be approached from both perspectives?
Well, so I can tell you very simply how to solve the problem of transparency and trust, which is I have no idea. Why would I know? Nobody knows as far as I know. Let me say a little more about that, though. So at the very least, I genuinely don't know. Transparency and trust rarely go together. So we all rely upon and trust things. I'll give you an old example, and the new examples are basically the phone in your pocket, the mobile. All of your experience with that is using a system that you don't understand. I don't understand it. I couldn't tell you how most of the things work in it. The old example is the ancient Egyptians used willow bark to relieve pain. It's an analgesic. They don't have anything that we would have, so they had a general sense of how what we call medicine works, but they didn't have a causal sense or specific about why willow bark worked. It was rediscovered in the late part of the 18th century. People started using it. No idea. It was Bayer aspirin was founded in 1899. Still no idea why aspirin worked. People still taking it, trusting it. It was only like 1950. A guy got a Nobel Peace Prize. A Nobel Prize for figuring it out. We use stuff all the time that we trust it and we don't know how it works. You use whatever app you're using on your mobile, whether it's a routing or it's a spelling corrector, or I don't know how they work. I trust them, and I'm right to trust them. We trust things primarily without knowing, without transparency. We trust things that we couldn't make transparent, like aspirin. So that relationship seems to me to be, overall, not a very tight one. Now, when something goes wrong, predictive policing is a great example, as are some of the other examples you brought up, and some that I brought up as well. These are cases where something's going wrong, we can tell it's going wrong because of the outcome. All right, that no women are getting hired from this system. It's rejecting all the women's applications, or whatever, the predictive policing system, or the sentencing system is the rate in America where we have something of race, we have some racism perhaps. Black defendants are getting sentenced to longer terms than white defendants. And we look at that and we say, that's not right. And so we lose trust in the system, as we should, because of those results. But we cannot interrogate, we cannot inspect the system. Well, actually, in those cases, we often can. But sometimes we cannot directly inspect, and so we have to come up with some other way of either stopping to use it because we've lost trust in it, or to send it back to the computer scientists who will do some adjustment, and we hope the outcomes now will represent our idea of fairness much better. These machines do things we can't, do some things better than we can. I'm certainly not saying everything they touch magically is better, but generally when we use them, you're right, better can mean faster, better can mean cheaper, and those are not nothing. I would argue in a longer talk that there are cases in history, many of them, where sufficient speed constitutes a very new type of technology, starting with computers in general, because computers also, old computers don't do anything we couldn't do by hand using statistical manipulation.
New ones don't either, we just don't have time.
Okay.
We don't have a billion years.
Yes. But in this case, they do some things that better in two senses as well. One is they beat us at Go. Now they beat us at chess, they beat us at video games. There's a very clear metric of better for playing games. And it's not that significant an example. But they beat us at Go. We've done the field test. We've taken the best Go players, and they lose. So and then the machine that... So that's one sort of thing. And the second, I think, is way more interesting. I'll just take a second, right? So in deep learning, which is a type of machine learning in which you simply pour in the data and you don't even tell it what the data represents. Now, the machine never understands what the data represents, but it knows that this is one cluster. So I'll give you an example. About 3 years ago, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York created a deep learning system they called Deep Patient. They took 700,000 anonymized, don't jump down. We're friends, by the way, let's be clear about that. Anonymized medical records, 700,000, each with about 500 data points, and put them into a deep learning system and said, here are some numbers. Just look at these numbers, because that's all the machine sees, is numbers. And in the deep learning system, you don't tell it, you don't say that these are symptoms and these are diseases. You certainly don't tell it the relationship between symptoms and diseases or medicines and diseases. Just numbers. And it processed them, and for many, overall it was able to predict, so you give it a patient record, because these things are tested, right? You give it a patient record and it will predict the onset of disease about as well as a human physician does in most instances. In some instances, significantly better. And in some instances where human physicians simply cannot predict the onset of disease, and the one I remember is schizophrenia, it was able to, with everything's probable, right? You're totally right, statistical analysis, with some degree of probability was able to predict the onset of schizophrenia and a couple other diseases that humans we can't predict. That's doing something we can't, and we can't understand how it did it either. That's That's new in its ability. It's also new in the type of model that it builds. It's not like the bureaucrat who has a statistical model that says, you know what, here are the factors that are relevant, we think. We're going to look at some issue. It's education level, it's economic, it's proximity to schools, the sorts of things, and let's model that and run it. That's great. It works somewhat, better than nothing. But these systems, they're creating their own models and sometimes ones that we can't understand. And I would say that is new as well.
So,
sorry, too long.
The difference there that I see, and that's actually a really interesting example, right? Because what did all of those doctors swear to before they did thing one in the real world? The Hippocratic Oath, right? And I think that one of the issues that we run into with a lot of these systems is intent and transparency of intent, right? Mm-hmm. If I have full transparency of intent, and I believe that I can trust that transparency of human intent, I don't care about process as much, right? And this gets us back to the willow bark, right? I don't care, I know that the doctor is he's barely better, okay, great, it's 1790, I'm seeing a physician. I think he's maybe better than the old woman in the house out in the woods, but honestly, they come out even in a lot of cases, and I don't know, is bleeding effective? But what I do know about that guy is he swore an oath, right? And maybe he's useless, maybe he's an idiot, but I trust, we come from a similar region of society. I see him as very much a fellow human being. I know he sees me as a fellow human being, and he swore an oath, right? And that is a thing that means something to me. I rely on the fact that he is trying to do his best, even if he doesn't understand, and even if I definitely don't understand what he doesn't understand, right? When I look at what Mount Sinai is doing there, I know that in that case, okay, this is medical research, the insurance companies haven't gotten involved yet, et cetera. I can actually trust the intent of that system. When I look at what Uber is doing with a self-driving car, I can't trust a single piece of their intent. They're as slimy as they come. They're basically, a large chunk of their business model is fraud and extortion. It's not, they're just trying to capture market share by burying competitors. These are not people who I'm going to trust to have correct intent around life safety decisions. And specifically, I do not trust them, that model of, does this do a better job than a human? In what cases does it do a better job than a human, right?
Crucial, absolutely.
Uber is trying to sell me, they're not just trying to sell me a self-driving car, they're trying to sell hostile capture of transport as a service so that they can extort money from society.
You should not be in marketing.
I'm in marketing for the communists. But what that's the thing that they're trying to do, broadly speaking, and there is no reason for me to trust that they have the correct intent there. And I think that, is it possible to use opaque systems well in that kind of context? Absolutely. There are a lot of structures of control and management that you build up around those systems in order to be able to trust them, right? I need to have a very good idea as a consumer, not necessarily that okay, is this system being I don't necessarily need to know, but I need to know that somebody knows, right? If we look at air traffic is a great example of this, the aerospace industry, right? I, as a consumer, know that somebody is doing a lot of work to make sure that those systems are managed with the correct intent. I actually do know a lot about the aerospace world because it's a super interesting example of socio-technical systems that are actually managed very well to very, very solid outcomes around reliability, despite having just insane amounts of complexity. And one of the things there, if you are, there are basically reporting liability structures that happen, right? If you see a thing that is wrong, and you report that thing is wrong, you can know absolutely that you will not get fired for saying that this thing is wrong. And in places, because there is a lot of competitive pressure, and in places where people try and cheat on that, the regulatory agencies just come down on those people like a bag of rocks, because they know that this is the thing that lets us keep flying, is the fact that there is this trust of intent. We don't have that for any of these automated systems. Even the automated system, even the corporate automated systems that in theory could be subject to that kind of control and rigor and like a requirement to act in the public good. And we absolutely don't have that for any of the state-run automated systems where, some of them, like, in places where we get public health automation, in theory there should be these things, and then we see like, oh, well, actually we're going to manipulate the inputs of this system because, the current government is fine with all the gay people dying, so, whatever. So we get that kind of manipulation. And then we get the foreign intelligence stuff where it's just really active, brutal manipulation, like, yeah, you've got a nice democracy there, but it's kind of in the way, so we're just going to destroy it, fuck you. So there's a real range here, and I think that if we can have trustable transparency of intent within a cohesive social structure and a cohesive social order, great. Now we can deal with more opaque systems. If we can't have that, it's sort of like, I'm paraphrasing from somewhere and I can't remember where, but woe be it to someone who is so poor that the only thing that they can pay people who work with them is money. And I think that if we have that kind of coherence of intent and social cohesion, then we can allow more opacity. And if we can't, then we're in the position of, well, we can only pay with money. It all has to be in contract law. It all has to be explicable. It all has to be fully.
We're so close to agreeing. So there's a bunch of things I do agree with you on. I tried to be clear in my opening statement comments that I don't want to trust corporate entities, nor in many cases governmental ones. I'm a little less, but that doesn't matter. I don't want to trust them. I want, at the very least, for them to be transparent, not about their intent, because you can't be transparent about intent, because intent is not a thing you can look at. What you can look at is outcomes. And it doesn't matter if Google says don't be evil or Facebook says connect the world or whatever their mottos are. That doesn't mean, I think you're going to agree, that doesn't mean anything. What matters is what they do. So in some cases we can inspect and we don't pay any real price for inspecting the data. I think it's often going to be more important to inspect the data than the algorithms, but we can inspect the data, we can inspect the algorithms, and great, we should do that. Where we think there's a trade-off between forcing transparent, understandable stuff, algorithms or data, and the outcomes that we want, which may be very important social goods like lower environmental impact, greater health, overall, et cetera, then I don't want transparency of intent because I don't know what that means. I want transparency of a statement of what we, not they, we want the goals to be. We care more, we being the social, whatever, the social group, but we care more about, I'll give you a quick example of this in a second, we care more about environmental impact than we do about fatalities or property damage. Then we measure whether they succeeded. That's transparency, not quite of intent, but of goals, and transparency of the metrics, and I hope good legal clubs to get companies to comply. The example I want to give is organ donation. So in the United States, there are people who need organs, there are people who donate organs, the supply, there are more people who need them than who want them. And so there's a complex system that I don't understand well, but that has a set of rules. It's optimized for something. Because you have to decide, does this liver go to a young patient or to an old patient, to a young patient who has a lower life expectancy statistically because of her behavior or whatever? Do you want to give the liver to the classical violinist or to the person who has greater social value, that's in quotes, and so forth? These are extremely difficult. I don't know how anybody comes up with this, but we have. And we are now, if we were to adopt, and I hope that we will, that we'll look at these systems and say, okay, this one we definitely want, it's either transparent or it's out. Sentencing stuff. for example, sentencing software. This one has such an enormous payoff. It can be 90% reduction. This is the, I think, sort of bogus figure that's bandied about. 90% reduction in fatalities with a complete system of autonomous vehicles. I disagree with you on that, what you've said, but that's fine. We'll just leave that. What is it that we want? We have to figure that out. It's going to be as hard as the organ rationing one. The organ rationing decisions were made, those decisions were possible to make about what the trade-offs are, what the values that we want, because they were not done in a large public debate. Yeah. We're going to have to figure out how to make very tough decisions about which of the goals we want out of these systems, and we're going to have to insist, and I completely agree with you, in many, many cases, we're going to have to and want to insist that we get to make those decisions, not the corporations who have terrible incentives in these matters.
My question here was if you think, well, I fear what the question is, Eleanor's question, I know what it is already, if we are even minimally prepared to actually face that question. A case that I cannot help coming back to is the Volkswagen emission scandal case. Mm-hmm. Because there's an example where you have a respectable company. If they were not perceived as Uber, this is like one all big industrial European conglomerate, specifically and deliberately designing their cars so they would cheat in one of the probably most sensitive things a car can do, which is pollute the environment. And you could take like the optimist view, which is that yes, but they were discovered and they were fined, they had to pay one of the hardest fines in history, or the other case, or the other route you could take is we have no idea how many Volkswagen emission scandals we have around us that we still haven't discovered, and that we may never discover. So if legislation, if the process that enables a state to have a certain saying about what a company can do can be pretty ineffective in specific conditions like this, can we evolve to a situation where we can be more effective? Or what do we need to change to prevent that there is X number of Volkswagen emission scandals around us that we have no power or agency to change?
So I have a brief two-part answer. The first is I don't know. Yeah. The second is it's not optimism to say, well, we caught the one bad company. It's, I think, realism to say this is how the world works, that there are people who have terrible incentives. They're going to continue to try to cheat. We will catch some, and we won't catch all of them, but we're going to keep on trying because that's the only way we can live in a better society, not a perfect one. We obviously can't live in a perfect society.
But there can be an alternative society where a Volkswagen and any other car company should have passed software audits so that, one of the important cases here is that the state doesn't even have the right to look at the code running Volkswagen cars. It was not even an option.
I mean, I think that kind of right to inspection, like, even if we have an opaque system, right? Even if we have an opaque system of social automation, there should still be a right to inspection. If nothing else, like, okay, fine, it's an opaque model. Let me test the model. Let me play with it, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have a right to have a model that is private that has social impacts. You may have a right to have a model that is opaque, but like, no, you want to have an impact on society? Congratulations, you're playing in the public sphere.
So does anything not have, or is there any carve-out, or is that true for all use of AI by any private organization?
It depends. I'm not sure what the scope of this would be. I'm making this shit up. But for instance, like certainly if you are designing control software for a potential particulate emitter in urban areas, no, you don't have a right to privacy in your source code. You have a right to IP rights in your source code, maybe. You have to provide access to auditors on condition of secrecy of the code, but not secrecy of the findings. Great, But part of that is one of the other things that we can say. Okay, maybe we can't control intent prima facie, but we can control intent post hoc, right? If every engineer and every manager who interacted with that software in a way that they could be shown to acquiesce to this intent of, misleading thing, did 20 years in prison. Like, screw fines, 20 years of their life because they killed 10,000 people a year for a decade. And those are the numbers. It's horrific. If you look at the PM3 emissions and their relation to the death curve, it's really actually quite bad. And say, okay, if you are someone who is manufacturing this software, yes, we want inspection, but in the same way that if you are a stock market trader, right, you are only allowed to communicate with other traders, with anyone else in your world, via logged and auditable communication mechanisms that are subject to audit. Subject to regular audit by financial regulatory authorities. And if you are found to have circumvented those mechanisms, we assume malice and you just go to jail. Or in theory, you go to jail. In practice, you don't, because we don't prosecute rich people. But that kind of system where we say, okay, yes, we're only going to catch you after the fact, but we require you to act in a manner that appears, the appearance of impropriety is considered impropriety. And we are going to use a big enough hammer that if we catch you having, we're going to say that this intent is sacrosanct. And if we catch you having violated this intent for public good, we are going to ruin your life. Therefore, and it's about corporate profits, but it's also companies are made out of people. So it has to be both personal and this is the thing where if it's a mistake, right, if there is no evidence of malice, people make mistakes. That's totally fine. If we have evidence of malice, we're now playing a completely different game. And I think that this is a place where what the system that actually works is how we actually construct these structures of liability. There's a lot of things to work out. But I think that there are places where we can actually look at intent. And we can actually, especially when you are building systems that have this kind of scalability. And one of the things, like when you got prescribed aspirin as an individual, a doctor made a trust decision to a provider or to, they decided that willow bark was the right option, if they were actually compounding themselves, whatever. But these trust levels were individual and it wasn't scalability, right? There wasn't this kind of, and when we started seeing scalability, when we had the early rise of pharmaceutical companies in the 1910s, the 1920s, et cetera, and we started to have, literal snake oil salesmen who were shipping a lot of units, then we suddenly got Food and Drug Regulatory Acts with real teeth because that scalability created a kind of culpability that wasn't there before.
So can I make an argument for chaos? So I think that's, I think no disagreement with anything you said, but it has made clear to me my personal discomfort, not with what you just said, but with the general approach to AI. We worry about it for very good reason. So let's engage in some regulatory action. And so you've just made it more complex by which is great. I think that's crucial. I want to make it even more complex because here's one type of thing that might happen when you take sort of the rationing of organ donations at scale to systems that touch all of us, like driverless cars will eventually, I think. We may disagree. So we can say let's say we decide that we are going to regulate publicly the optimizations, the goals of these systems. And we're going to say drive down fatalities first, and second is environmental, et cetera, et cetera. And we do that. And that's going to be really, really hard. It's easy. For some of it, it gets really hard as you go down the pyramid of values, the hierarchy of values. But we do it. We set up some type of regulatory mechanism, and we do it. Good. I'm in favor of this. Now it's a year into it. The system has changed, some more cars, less cars, whatever. And there's a portion of town that says, look, these systems they're routing themselves, right? And they're routing them right through. This is a playground in a school, and we're getting high traffic going through, and it's meeting. It's great because, in theory, it's great because it's driving down the fatalities and the environmental impact. I mean, all that's working, but you're destroying a neighborhood. And let's just say the company, the car manufacturers or the government doesn't pay attention. Quite likely they won't. At that point, the community, I hope, starts to engage in the political process in whatever way that it can, whether it's by demonstrations or voting, all the sorts of mobilizing in the way that people do. Now we have a political mess because there's another part of town that says, well, yeah, but if they don't go here, then they're going to come here, right? They're going to blaze past all the local stores and the local merchants won't. And there is no regulatory way of coming up with good decisions about that sort of trade-off. these systems, just using driverless cars as one example, are going to raise this is your point, I think, raise these sorts of issues that we don't have clean mechanisms for. So it's not despair. We have mechanisms. It's called government. It's called citizenship. It's called consumer action, customer action. But they're all messy. They're emergent and messy sorts of processes. We are going to end up over and over with these sorts of issues raised that we don't have easy answers for. That's, I think, the world that we are entering because of these systems. To think that some form of regulation is going to solve this for us is to think that we agree more about our values than societies generally, in fact, do.
But see, I think that's great. Because now we actually are at the point of having the question and having the negotiation about values. Regulation as a structural toolkit does not solve value questions for us. What effective regulation does is it puts handles on the world for us to then have a conversation about how we want it steered. It's not about regulation as solving the problem. It's about regulation as enabling the debate. And one of the things, and this is a place at the conference that we've met at, there was a lot of talk about this idea of permissionless innovation, right? You know, we built the internet with this core mindset in mind that anybody could just show up and throw something into the internet, and it was the fish pond that anybody could come play and fish in, and it was sort of great.
It was
Except it gave us many amazing, wonderful things, and then it ate the world. And the problem that we're having is that, is permissionless innovation a reasonable thing to do for, a new way to publish music? Yeah, probably, fine, whatever. Is permissionless innovation a thing that we should do when it's about, traffic patterns in playgrounds? No, actually, it's not. And I think that the thing where we get into a lot of the problem with these kind of statistical automation companies and this kind of thing is it's applying that kind of mindset. Well, yeah, I'm going to go automate your life. What are you going to do about it? Come stop me. And that doesn't work. And that's one of the problems that I have with the notion of self-driving cars is this notion of inevitability, right? We can talk about whether or not they're going to be able to achieve their technical goals. If they achieve their technical goals, awesome, no problem. We can talk about whether that's a social good separately, okay, yes, fewer fatalities, but also mass unemployment. There's some complicated social negotiations that we should engage in an intentional way there. But it's the idea that, well, if it's possible, it's inevitable. If it's possible, it is necessarily going to happen. And I think that, this is the same thing that has given us, we've got, maybe 30 years more of globally organized civilization before climate change-driven disruption starts making it impossible for us to have long-term trade. That's permissionless innovation for you there. That's we put however many gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, and now it's killing everything we've ever seen. And I think that maybe progress was a nice idea, and this idea of we have this the technological possibility becomes technological inevitability. I feel like that's one of the core things, the core assumptions in this set of statistical automation, that, well, it's possible to do statistical automation, and there might be some good things that would come out of it, therefore it will happen.
No, that's not the reason it will happen. So, maybe that AVs...
Or that is the assumption that because we can do it, therefore we can do it.
Well, it's because it's faster and cheaper in your terms.
We're going to have to open up to the questions very, very soon. I just wanted to touch one thing very fast, because it has to do, I think, everything with what Eleanor is really saying, which is in a way around the social contract around these systems in different ways. And we're in a very interesting moment in which it seems the world is kind of splintering in different ways in their approaches toward this. You could very broadly say that you still have the Silicon Valley US innovation first approach, which is very much about companies are the drivers of innovation and we need to foster that. You have the European model, which is starting to be hold on one second, we really need to ensure that some still social welfare, the tiny bit of social democracy that we still have left ensures that some things are preserved, and this year probably has been a big year for this. We have the Chinese model, which is basically the state is going to define as much innovation as you're going to have and what you're going to be able to do or not. How do we start thinking about what is a social pact that we are all happy with? I mean, one of my bigger concerns, for instance, in the driverless cars scenario is that driverless cars, let's say that they work and that actually they save lives, they save CO2 emissions. They create like these huge repositories of knowledge about, for instance, cities, like the ways people behave, the way the patterns and rhythms of the city kind of like react. They are like these really learning machines that, to which municipalities have no access whatsoever. You know, they exist in these closed black boxes that are actually only preserved by specific big companies that get to understand, and we don't even have a say in. So how do we actually move, and every society, really, to what kind of social pact around the systems they want to develop? And this is a very super difficult question, and we have very little time. So maybe if you can give me your 30 seconds.
Okay, so you solve the fact that you have sensors, cars that are sensors driving through cities that aren't providing their access by regulating them, require them to hand over their data. I mean, that's totally within the power of regulators, I think. And a new social, it's too big, I don't know, it's too big, I'm not smart enough.
I guess but just handing over the data isn't necessarily enough, right? Because those sensors can be structured like a smart sensor in the world is inherently asking questions about reality. And what kinds of questions it's asking depends on what the intent from which that sensor was structured. And the intent that a municipality might want that sensor to be structured with is not necessarily the intent that Uber or Google or whoever is going to bear in mind. So I think, like, for instance, I am a big fan of automated transport as a public good. I call them trams. You know, and like even the notion of like car versus tram, right? These imply models of your relationship to civilization. You know, there's the quote, a rich country is not a country where everyone has cars, it's a country where rich people take public transit. You know, because that's a country where you actually have this coherent, consistent social good and a strong social fabric that is adequately resourced, where you don't have to have individualized provision of basic social needs. And you know, so if we look at you know the questions that Uber might have their cars ask, it's probably going to be looking at like, okay, so we've got these pedestrian sensors, and we're going to look at pedestrian flow and patterns around shopping and whatever, versus you know a municipality might care more about pedestrian dwell time and use of public space as a commons. You know, and that's a very you know, I mean, if it's very raw data, you might be able to pull that data out, pull both questions out of it in either way. But municipalities don't have the money to develop the software packages to ask those questions. So they're going to get the answers that come out of the data that they're handed. And so this is where I think that, you know, if we have self-driving cars, great, deploy them. They're all state-owned. If you want a self-driving car, it has to be a social good. No privately owned self-driving cars, you know. And I say this as an anarchist who doesn't necessarily believe in state ownership exactly, but you know, we can get into geographically bounded, obligate infrastructural collectives later.
Vamos a daros la palabra ahora. Como veis, tenemos muchas más preguntas que respuestas y ahora vamos a poner más preguntas aún sobre la mesa, las vuestras. No sé si tenemos un micrófono. Sí.
Thank you for letting us speak English, by the way.
Tenemos un micro para la sala. Si queréis, lo que podemos hacer es coger 2 o 3 preguntas juntas para poder discutirlas juntos y ir más rápido, tener más posibilidades de hablar de más cosas. You guys were translators? You were translating devices?
I did not get a translation of that.
Okay, then I will translate it for you if it's Spanish.
It's working. I may be on the wrong channel.
Okay.
Channel 1.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por el diálogo. Me ha gustado especialmente, Leonor, sobre el marco que ha planteado el tema de la inteligencia artificial, especialmente en una sociedad que, como decía un viejo militante, el tigre no es vegetariano. Es decir, existe un afán de poder, un afán de ganancia de grandes empresas, o de estados como el Estado chino, y por tanto el ciudadano tiene una gran debilidad. Y el fin está en los medios, como el árbol en la semilla, decía Gandhi. Por tanto, cuando, por ejemplo, en el sistema financiero actual ha generado una gran crisis que la están pagando los más débiles. Aquí la notamos, pero en el tercer mundo, con hambre, con esclavitud. ¿De qué manera la inteligencia artificial, como la robótica, que es un patrimonio de toda la humanidad, de las universidades públicas, de muchos cientos de años, este conocimiento está en manos de unos pocos que aquí está generando precariedad, falta de democracia, de libertad, y en ciertos modos en el tercer mundo está generando pues esta crisis? Hay sistemas financieros que funcionan con inteligencia artificial, que deciden las cosas en nanosegundos con criterios de afán de poder y no criterios de voluntad de sentido, de bien común, que es de lo que estábamos hablando. Por tanto, hace falta una nueva antropología. Insisto, el tigre no es vegetariano, una antropología donde se prime la dignidad del ser humano y no el afán de ganancia que tiene empresas como Google, que están también utilizando la inteligencia artificial en armamento.
No sure if there's a question over there, but...
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree. I would like to see... I guess the problem that we have there is fundamentally a problem of governance. It's not a problem of technology. Like, this technology can do many things if we tell it to do these things. It's a question of who is telling that technology to do what, and why are they telling it that. And I think that it is, statistical automation is interesting because it is a force multiplier for the impact of these organizations, but it doesn't change anything beyond that. And so I think that if we want to see that kind of structural political change, then we need to make that structural political change. And that happens the old-fashioned way. It doesn't happen through, the technology isn't what generates that.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, ante todo, muchísimas gracias por esta interesantísima serie de charlas sobre un tema, desde luego, que tenemos, estoy aquí, que tenemos todos entre manos y bueno, que ya estamos viviendo en el momento actual. Fundamentalmente me interesa mucho el tema regulatorio y me interesaría, bueno, se ha hablado mucho, me alegra que no haya salido porque es un tópico, pero bueno, las famosas leyes de Asimov, que bueno, se ha debatido mucho si podíamos o no tratarlas y traerlas de alguna manera, de algún modo adaptado, para limitar el uso de la inteligencia artificial. Se ha hablado evidentemente que no podemos entender, ya estamos en un momento en que no podemos entender como humanos cómo funcionan estos algoritmos, cómo evolucionan, cómo aprenden. La cuestión es, ¿podemos regular para que por lo menos esos algoritmos funcionen como funcionen, no nos dañen a nosotros como especie, por lo menos como valor fundamental en que todos podemos estar de acuerdo, más allá de otros valores como el medio ambiente o derechos de los animales, etcétera? Y se ha hablado también de tener un botón rojo de apagado de esa tecnología. Si en un momento determinado pensamos que eso puede, a una máquina, por ejemplo, no se puede meter en la cárcel, se ha hablado de meter en la cárcel evidentemente a personas, a una máquina evidentemente no va a ser una coacción suficiente, sí un botón rojo. Y luego una cuestión final, si estamos a tiempo de hacerlo, ¿no? Si ya en este momento pues ya no vamos un poco tarde para implementar estos controles a nivel de código, a nivel de, obviamente, de obligar a los desarrolladores a implementar estos controles y en manos de quién van a quedar. Nada más. Muchas gracias.
So, I think that Asimov structure of we have these 3 laws to constrain robots, that puts us back in the box of artificial intelligence is the god in the box. It's magic, right? And that's not what we actually have. Humans can't understand algorithms. I'm a programmer. I understand algorithms every day. It's what I do for a living. It's not actually that hard. Understanding the data that they work on is where it gets more complicated. But again, you can model the outcomes of these systems, right? We can look at the things that they do in the world. We can require rigor there. That part isn't actually that complicated. It's more about, do we choose to do so? Do we choose to do these things? yes, we absolutely have the developer time to go figure out the outcomes of these technologies before we deploy them. We can absolutely require rigor. We can absolutely regulate on intent. All of these things are entirely doable. It's just a question of political will and decision making. We don't actually know how yet, but you don't get to ship until you can prove outcomes.
Well, I mean, all AI systems, all machine learning systems are, they're trained on, they take a set of data, I think all. They're trained on a set of data and you hold back some good percentage of them in order to test whether the results are what you want. You put them in the field and all sorts of things can happen, unintended consequences, terrible treatment. You discover that some classes of people that we care about all people, but some classes historically discriminated against, were not included in the data, and you don't discover this until, and there's tons of stories of AI going wrong. But I think it's really important. The panic around AI, I think, is overstated. Every one of you is using AI every day, and you're really glad you have it. Every time, does anybody use a search engine of any sort? Do you use any, don't have to ask, any routing software, word processing? How many of you are overwhelmed with spam the way you were in 2000? You're not, because of a sort of early version, a Bayesian set of algorithms. A tremendous amount of what you do online that is valuable to you in various ways, sometimes just because it's faster or cheaper, but sometimes because it's making your life better in various ways. It's AI. It's not this thing that is waiting as a threat and the only solution is to bring regulators down on it hard. There are really, as we're moving forward, there are really important uses of AI that are the sorts of things we've been talking about, which is not search algorithms or well, you actually did. We'll leave that aside for the moment. And you're right, of course. These are big systems that affect us in very important ways, and we need to be able to regulate them to make sure they're doing what we want, that they're not being used by our own oppressive governments, either on purpose or thoughtlessly against the most vulnerable. Of course, this is also very significant technology. But I do not feel good about leaving this session with the impression that all of AI is a threat to humanity. There are elements of it that are tremendously important because they're dealing with tremendously important systems, and we need to be very careful. And Eleanor's suggestions about how to regulate and her concerns about not trusting the intent of the organization, it's 100% agreement. But that's not all that AI is.
And I guess I would say that any tool of scalable social control should be regulated. AI is not special. It's that, like, if we build tools of social or environmental control that allow, like, this kind of runaway scalability, we want to regulate all of those. It doesn't matter if they use machine learning. I don't care.
You want to regulate emissions from cars?
That we need to have some structures of coherence around social control.
Yes.
Creo que tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta.
La responsabilidad de quien crea el código y la responsabilidad de quien lo pone a funcionar. Si el código daña, es responsable. Si quien lo lanza es responsable.
¿Qué quieres decir? ¿Estás diferenciando entre responsabilidad del programador y responsabilidad del gestor o de...?
Sí, sobre todo si se lanza un código y no hay un gestor, porque el propio código lo consideramos gestor de sí mismo, ¿qué hacemos? Los daños alguien los tendrá que pagar o se socializan.
I don't even know if you...
So, societies have very complex systems for assessing responsibility, liability, and punishment. It varies from system to system. It's one thing if you're Volkswagen and you are purposefully deceiving the social controls that we have on these important social systems, pollution controls. It's another thing if it's a human error, if it's pilot error and it's understandable. It's another thing if the pilots were not tested for alcoholism, for being drunk before they go on. There's no simple answer to this. And AI is not special in this. It totally depends on the situation, but we do have well-formulated, very nuanced processes already in place for dealing with questions of liability, responsibility, restitution, punishment, and the rest of it. Those systems need to be brought into play wherever systems have social impact, whether they are AI systems or transportation systems or anything. Is that enough of a dodge? I mean, there isn't a simple answer to that question.
I don't think there is a simple answer. I think the answers that we have right now are maybe not the answers that we would like to have in the world, but there is no one answer, and there shouldn't be one answer. One answer would be oversimplification.
And it's not, one answer is not going to be transparent algorithms.
Yeah.
That's not the one answer. Sometimes yes.
I want to mention 3 books. I'm going to give you an answer in 3 books. Those books are Sidney Decker's A Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, which I'm bringing up because you mentioned pilot error. Pilot error does not exist. It is not a category in the world. But which talks about human culpability in kind of mixed human technical systems and what it often masquerades for. And then I want to mention Nancy Levison's Engineering a Safer World, where she's talking about how we design highly reliable systems. It's a relatively dense book. It's absolutely worth slogging through. She's mostly not talking about these kind of statistical automation and large-scale automation, but she is talking about systems of automated control. So a lot of stuff in aerospace, a lot of stuff in medicine, that kind of thing. And then the last one is James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, which looks at, for instance, like one of the things you mentioned is, well, we always reserve a bit of the data, then we test it on that, and we see, we check. But that checks the inputs, it doesn't check the closed loop. And then all of the outcomes and the negative outcomes start seeing, and this is because you can't test the closed loop unless you deploy it for real in the world. And then you have to accept those outcomes. So, so those are my 3 books to start understanding this, where these things might be going a bit better.
Any book recommendation to close up, David?
The easy one to recommend is Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. If you want to see the case against, if you want to understand machine learning bias, a very readable book, very good book. Frank Pasquale has written about the black box. Frank Pasquale, black box. Google it, you'll find it. And there's a really interesting argument for
Black Box Society.
Black Box Society, and the Book of Why by Jonah. See, old people remember only one of people's 2 names, and I got the Jonah probably wrong, and I can't remember the last one. But the Book of Why, he is a computer scientist, he's a very deep and wonderful one who's arguing against my position, which is, I agree with him actually on this, but that machine learning should be given a model of how the world works. At the level of causation, they would work much better. So
no tenemos más tiempo. Muchas gracias a todos por habernos acompañado. Sabemos que esta sesión ha estado lleno de detalles, de cuestiones escabrosas. Esperamos no haber sido excesivamente apocalípticos en algunos momentos. Me preocupa eso, que saldremos con más preguntas con las que entramos, y esta es una conversación que no acabará rápido y que esperemos que acabe bien, que es lo importante. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you.